That's easy. Okay. So the sikha this week is an overlap between the Parsha and the topic is the Parsha combined with the 20th of Cheshvan, which this year actually is not this week, it's next week, but most years it's during this week, Parsha's Vayera. Now, the Rebbe quotes a story that happened with the Rebbe Rashab. When he was 4 or 5 years old, he went into the Tzemach Tzedek because it was his birthday. And on his birthday, he would go into the Tzemach Tzedek to get a bracha. His grandfather, who was the Rebbe at the time, Tzemach Tzedek was the third Rebbe, then the Rebbe Marash, and then the Rebbe Rashab. So Tzemach Tzedek was the Rebbe Rashab's grandfather. So when the Rebbe Rashab was a little kid, on his birthday, he would go into the Tzemach Tzedek and get brachas. And one year when he was turning 4 or 5, it was this week's Parsha, which is Parsha's Vayera. What does Vayera mean? Close. No, you're right about the saw, and he appeared or revealed himself. He was seen. So basically, it's talking about Hashem visiting Avram, coming and, hanging out with Avram. And so having learned about that in the Parsha that week, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Rashab, when he came into the Tzemach Tzedek, he burst out crying. And so Tzemach Tzedek asked him, what's going on? What are you crying about? So he replied that he was learning Chumash, the Parsha of the week, that Hashem appeared to Avram Avinu, and he was crying that Hashem never appeared to him. Not bad for a 4-year-old, huh? He was crying that Hashem didn't appear to him the way that he appeared to Avram. So the Tzemach Tzedek responded to him that when someone at the age of 99 years old decides to circumcise himself, it's fitting that Hashem should reveal himself to him. That was his response, and the Rebbe Rashab stopped crying, he accepted it, and that was that. Now, this is something that the Rebbe talks about a lot, is that anytime the Frierdiker Rebbe tells over something that happened to him, that means it's meant to be public knowledge, right? Anything that the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted to remain personal, he wouldn't share. So anything that he shared, he obviously intended for it to be public knowledge. And if he intended for it to be public knowledge, obviously that means that there are lessons for us to learn from it. The Rebbe actually says, many, many times said that the Frierdiker Rebbe told him something and told him not to tell anyone. But the Frierdiker Rebbe knew that if he told the Rebbe, he wouldn't be able to hold himself back from sharing it with the Chassidim. So that means that whenever the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe anything, he meant for it to be publicized because he knew that the Rebbe wouldn't be able to resist. Right? It's like, I have no idea with this as a parent a lot. Before you tell something to maybe, something's going to be a surprise that it's going to be like for, maybe the oldest kid or the older two or something. Sometimes you have to stop and think, can we tell them in advance? Because if it's just too exciting, they're not going to be able to resist and they're going to say something in front of the other kids and then they're going to realize that they're missing out and it's going to make everything really complicated. So if you know that someone's not going to be able to resist publicizing information you don't want to be public, you don't tell them. It's that simple. So Rebbe says that the Frierdiker Rebbe knew I wouldn't be able to resist. So if he told me, he meant for it to be public. Anyways, but here, this is a story that was shared, that was told to us, which means that obviously the story is relevant to us. And the question is, how is either part of this relevant to us? I don't know. I could tell you when I was 4 years old, I wasn't crying that Hashem didn't appear to me. If only I was crying about that now. And then what? If someone's a tzaddik at 99 years old and decides to circumcise himself, then he deserves for Hashem, or it's fitting for Hashem to reveal himself to him. How's that relevant to everybody? Most people don't reach 99 years old. Most people are not. Tzaddik said when a Jew at tzaddik reaches at 99 years old, realizes he needs to circumcise himself, no part of that is relevant to almost anyone. For some people, the 99 part is relevant, some, and it takes 99 years to get there. So what's going on? So why is this story shared with us? What's the message in this story for us? Is that clock the right time? Yeah, okay. Oh, new battery? So So one thing the Rebbe points out is that, yes, I never cried about Hashem revealing himself to me when I was 4 years old. And then what did I say? The next thing I said was, if only that would happen now, how if I know what happened to me now, let alone at 4 years old. And the Rebbe says that's the whole message of the story. That's the whole point. Right? Remember what we talked about last week? What we talked about last week was the fact that Avram's legacy is something that every single one of us has. It can never be taken away. What is it that we all have inside? Every one of us has a part of Hashem inside of us. And that is the truest identity of who we are, the neshama, even though we may not always be aware of it and our behavior might at sometimes not reflect this. The bottom line is our neshama, our soul, the part of Hashem within us is our truest and foremost identity. And the reason this story is being shared with us is to let us know that, yes, every single one of us has sufficient connection to Hashem to be disturbed by this. And every one of us is entitled to be disturbed by the fact that we don't get to experience Hashem the way that Avraham Avinu did. And that's true both of a literal 4-year-old and a figurative 4-year-old. What do I mean by a figurative 4-year-old? There's something called, right, in halacha, a person's obligated only to do the mitzvahs that they know about, right? We talked about this last week. If someone doesn't know about something or they're not capable of fulfilling a mitzvah, then they're not expected to and they're not obligated to. Technically speaking, the obligation to fulfill mitzvah starts at 12 or 13 at bas mitzvah bar mitzvah. And that includes the mitzvah of learning Torah. Especially for guys. Guys have an obligation to learn Torah every second of their life, unless they're doing something else that specifically justifies not learning Torah in that moment. But that, sorry? It's hardcore. That only begins at bar mitzvah at 13. So why do kids learn before they're 13? Why do we teach kids about halachas and what to do, etc., before they're 13 if they're not obligated to? Right, it's not a trick question, very simple, so they should know what's going on. Sorry? Right. So there is actually a mitzvah, it's a rabbinic mitzvah, mitzvah d'Rabbanan, which is chinuch, which means there's a mitzvah to educate children, so that when they get older, they know. So even though now chinuch before bar mitzvah is not an obligation on the children's part, it's an obligation on the parents' part. But halachically, the mitzvah of chinuch doesn't begin when a child is born, right? You're not expected to start teaching a kid how to say brachas like when you're still in the hospital, like a day after they're born, obviously, right? It doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't it make sense? This is like, it's not a trick question, and it's like so obvious that it's going to seem like it's a ridiculous question, and maybe it kind of is, but it's still a question. Why is it that we're not obligated to teach our children how to say brachas like while they're still in the hospital when they were just born? Very simple answer. Sorry? That's right, they're not able to. And it's the same reason, that we don't, there's a term that's used a lot, and it's a very important term, and that is age appropriate. Right? There are different behaviors that are age appropriate for children at different ages, and adults, frankly. Right? And there are certain things that maybe an 8-year-old should already really know, but that you'd be wasting your time to try to explain to a 4-year-old, because it's not age appropriate for a 4-year-old. Maybe it is age appropriate for a 6-year-old, and by 8, they should have already known that. So generally speaking, the age of chinuch, I believe, is generally, broadly speaking, set at about 6. So once a kid is 6 years old, the parents actually have a halachic obligation to start really teaching them Torah, teaching them about mitzvahs, so that they start to get the hang of things. When a kid's 2 or 3 years old, they're very limited in terms of what they can understand, right? Their brains are very, very on in their development. Now, that being said, I think that parents, by and large, grossly underestimate how much kids at a very young age, even months old, can catch on to. But that's more generally, I think, emotions and routines and things like that. But you can't explain to a concept, an idea to a 6-month-old kid, or even a 2 or 3-year-old kid, 4-year-old kid. What you're able to explain to them academically is quite limited. And so the mitzvah chinuch doesn't really start yet. Mitzvah chinuch generally starts at about 6, because until then, they're not really up to it. They don't have the hardware. They're not really developed enough to be able to learn things that much in that sort of way. That being said, chinuch also, for a few reasons, the Rebbe says that chinuch begins at conception, right? If someone's like, okay, we don't have to do anything Jewish with this kid, and then when they turn 6, we'll start teaching them. It's like, you are way behind. And even if you start when they're born, you're behind. Because when a child is born, in a textbook case, they've already existed for 9 months. And it's fascinating to see this actually now in the data. They say that children, when they're born, actually recognize both parents' voices because they've heard them through the uterus, right? The ears have been working for a while already, and the specific tone of both parents' voices are familiar, and you can measure that children recognize the tone of voice of both of their parents because they've been hearing their voices already for weeks, months. I don't know at what point, they start really hearing. So yeah, children literally hear things in utero. And that's just physically. Then on top of that, there's the neshama and the spirituality. So the Rebbe emphasized very strongly that, from way before a child's born, as soon as someone finds out that they're pregnant, it's important to really try to do everything they can to surround themselves with things that are, spiritually positive and pure, and to avoid things that are negative, because everything that happens to a mother is communicated to the child one way or another, right? You look at any medication, it'll say on the bottle, consult with doctor, or even any supplement, anything, consult with your doctor before using whilst pregnant or breastfeeding, right? Why? Because a child in utero physically gets their blood they don't get their blood from the mother technically. The blood's separate, which is why you could have different blood types. But what the placenta is an interface between the two blood supplies. So the two blood supplies get very close to each other, and nutrients transfer from the mother's blood to the baby's blood, and waste transfers from the baby's blood to the mother's blood. And so everything that's in the mother's blood can be passed on into the child's blood, right? So if a mother is taking medication, it's important just to be aware of whether or not it's safe for a baby. And this is true of everything. It's true of medications. It's true of stress levels, right? When we're stressed, people think, a lot of people underestimate just how real stress is. Stress, there are hormones in our blood with which we can measure stress, because stress elevates the levels of some hormones, depresses the levels of other hormones. That's why it's more common, for example, for people to get sick when they're stressed, when they're nervous, right? Because stress changes the levels of hormones in our blood, and it reduces the effectiveness of the immune system. It's a very, very real thing. So if a mother who's pregnant is under a lot of stress, that can actually have a physiological impact on the baby, because it changes the levels of hormones and neurotransmitters and other things in her blood, and her blood is supplying things to the baby's blood. That's the way it's designed. So everything about a mother's experience has an impact on the baby. It's true physically, right? We see it physically in the placenta, in the transfer of nutrients and things across the two blood supplies. And it's also true spiritually. And what, generally speaking, with these kind of things, whatever is true of one is true of the other, because they're a pair and they work together and they're equivalent and parallel. So everything that happens, and this is why, just for example, one of the things that that Chabad Chassidim are very particular about during pregnancy is not going to zoos to see, impure animals, things like that, being very careful about what we speak, being particularly careful about the music we listen to, the things we talk about, all these sorts of things, because everything that we experience, the same way that everything that comes into our body is communicated and passed on to the baby, everything that comes into our soul through our eyes and ears and mouth, etc., is passed on and communicated to the baby. So yes, it's true that chinuch starts from the beginning of existence, well before birth, but that's more things that are going to affect the baby non-academically, right? Physiologically, emotionally, spiritually. In terms of academically, and even then, if you start, I say brachas with kids from when they're born. And that way, when they're like, maybe 1.5, 2, and they're just starting to talk, they can start saying brachas, and they're so familiar, they've been hearing it multiple times a day since, they were born. And then when a kid's maybe 2, 2.5, and they're just learning how to string together a phrase, they can already say the brachas because they practiced. So that's about the routine and the skill more than the academic learning. But when it comes to academic learning, it's, they're very limited. And that's why the chinuch, the mitzvah of chinuch only begins at 6. And the Rebbe points out here that the story doesn't just say when he was a kid. It actually says when he was 4 or maybe 5 years old. It's not clear exactly. It's either 4 or 5 based on the information that we have. It has to be one of those 2 ages. And the reason that it tells us that age is because both 4 and 5 are before the halachic age of chinuch. We're talking about a kid here who isn't academically capable of their parents being required halachically to start teaching them Torah. And even at that age, he had this question. And if it was something that was just for him, it wouldn't have been told to us. If it was told to us, it was told to us so that we could learn from it. And one of the messages from this story is that even if a person is, hasn't yet reached the level at which, or the age, maybe rather than age, we should say the stage in development in which it makes sense to be halachically liable or required to teach them. This still makes sense for them. And that could be also figuratively, if someone hasn't really been exposed to much Judaism, someone's just learning basics, can't really expect, like there's a limit to how much you can expect of them. They may be figuratively not yet obligated, not yet at that level of those expectations. Both literally and physically, this is something that is relevant to everyone. Because this is who we are. Who we are, Avram's legacy is that we have a part of Hashem inside of us. And that's why Yitzchak was born unnaturally, right? We talked about that last week. Mm-hmm. So if this is who we are who we are before we know how to speak, and we are who we are before we're, academically proficient and capable. We are who we are from the moment we begin to exist. And if who we are is someone whose legacy is that we have a part of Hashem inside of us, we have an irreversible, irrevocable, undamageable, immortal connection to Hashem, then it makes sense for every single one of us to be like, to wonder, how come I don't get to experience Hashem? Why doesn't Hashem reveal himself to me? I may not be as great as someone else, but Hashem is still mine. I'm still Hashem's. Why shouldn't I get to experience it? And that's why the story specifically tells us when he was 4 or 5 years old, he wasn't even at the age of chinuch yet. It doesn't matter whether or not we're literally at the age of chinuch. It doesn't matter whether or not we're figuratively at the age of chinuch. It doesn't matter where we are or are not up to. It doesn't matter what we have or have not achieved or learned or anything else. This is something that is a birthright of every one of us, this connection to Hashem and relationship with Hashem, which means that it makes sense and it's a reasonable demand, or it's something that it's reasonable for all of us to be upset about, the fact that Hashem hasn't revealed himself to us. So that's number one, that's the message of the story. It's telling us that, don't underestimate your relationship with Hashem. It actually makes sense that you, exactly where you are, maybe, before the developmental stage of chinuch, whether literally or figuratively or otherwise, I'm not sure what the otherwise is, both maybe, it still makes sense for you to want this and to be upset, because this is who we are, and this is our legacy. This is our identity. Now, there are 2 parts, right? It's a dialogue, and there are two things that happen here. Number 1 is the question that was asked, and number 2 is the response that was given. And so the response was, what the Tanakh Tzaddik said to the Rebbe Rashab was, when a Yid Tzaddik understands, let me have a look at the exact word, I think that's what it says. When he decides to circumcise himself at 99 years old, it's fitting that Hashem should reveal himself to him. has everybody here seen the Mishnah, learned the Mishnah about, it talks about what different ages, what in Pirkei Avos? When we're 5 years old, start learning Chumash, Mishnah, right? And it goes on and on and on. And it talks about every age, what a person, it's talking about what's age appropriate developmentally throughout stages of childhood and youth, and then throughout stages of adulthood. It talks about, what's appropriate, what we should be focusing on, or what our gifts are, what stages we've reached, and at each age, what's the thing that we've become ripe for. And it does that all the way up to 90 years old. And what does it say when someone's 100? Does anyone? No?
What?
What does it say in the Mishnah about someone who's 100 years old? It's as if he's dead and has passed away and is nullified from the world. Thanks. Who wants to live to 100? Right? It's like, gee, that's a really nice thing to say to all the people who are 100 years old, right? People 100, and we celebrate when someone lives and they're old and old age and they have wisdom and experience and all these things. And then the Mishnah is like, yeah, they're basically as good as dead. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't align with what we know to be the priorities, right? Halacha always talks about you have to respect your elders and learn from your elders, and age is wisdom. And zokin, the word zokin means age, it means wisdom. How is it that then when the Mishnah talks about every age, like 100 years old, as if they're dead and they've departed from the world, nullified from the world? It's like, first of all, it's a bit horrifying. And second of all, it doesn't make sense. We know enough about Torah and about Mishnah to know that that's obviously not what it means. So what does it mean? So the question is, what does 100 mean? And again, we're going to be talking about age figuratively now, not literal age on the passport. There's a Yiddish expression that says, Chassidische Jahren gehen nicht nach Passport. The Chassidische age isn't determined by the passport, right? It's determined by our behavior. It's determined by our maturity, right? And it's true of everybody, right? There are some people who you say, you'll often hear people say, or maybe you've said it yourself about something, you're like, oh, wow, this person really matured, right? Since I saw them last. There are also some people who are just intrinsically mature, even when they're young. And there are some people who are like 70 years old and they're still a little kid and have no concept, right? Maturity isn't only something that happens as we age. It's also something that some people just have and some people don't. Right? So that's what it says. Chassidish age doesn't go by the passport. What goes by the passport is, look, and it makes sense that legally you have these things. You have to work with something. Right? But there are plenty of people who shouldn't be buying alcohol at 21 and plenty of people who shouldn't be driving at 16. What are you going to do? Like, if you're running a country of 330 million people, you have to have some metrics and some things that you work with. You can't do an assessment of every person and figure it out. It doesn't make any sense. And all of law is like that. Halacha is like that. There are a lot of things halachically and certainly legally that's true, that there are these sort of, broad stroke descriptions of when someone's this age, then they could do this and then that's appropriate. When for some people it's appropriate early and for some it's later. It's like, yeah, but if you have a legal system, you have to pick an age to work with. That's the way it works. You have to have something. So, but ultimately maturity isn't determined by age. There's some degree of correlation that hopefully most people become somewhat more mature as they become older. But maturity is not determined by age at all. Our maturity is determined by personality, it's determined by a sense of responsibility, it's determined by the work we do on ourselves. So the question is, what does 100 years old mean figuratively? There's a level of maturity that is equated with 100 years old, and what's the figurative maturity? So what strikes you just about the number 100? Some obvious things that strike you about the number 100.
That's 100.
Yeah, not the age, just the number. The number 100. What does the number 100 make you think of?
Like 100%, like a good grade. Got everything.
Perfect, complete. Good. Anything else? 10 squared. 10 by 10 is 100. Sorry.
Not a math brain.
I think math brains are not necessarily going to realize that that's like the thing I'm waiting for you to say. It's like I have a tendency to do that. I'm catching on. Right. So 100 is 10 squared. But it's more than just that, right? In a metric system, which basically everyone in the world is smart enough to use except for the US. Right? It's called the metric system because it's a system. It's systematic. 10, 100, 1,000, right? 1, 0.1, 0.01. Like it actually works that like we have this metric system where things go in tens and then tens are multiplied, become hundreds and thousands and 10,000 and 100,000. And then you've got like inches and yards and miles. And it's like, what? What does one have to do with the other? How are you supposed to remember like how much of one is in the other? And ounces and pints and gallons, all of this stuff. Like, I don't know, I don't see any system there. Right? The metric system is a very standard system. It's easy to remember. It's systematic. It's very organized, which is why 100% is like a universal thing that, you know, that's how grades are often given because it's easy to remember. It's easy to understand. It's clear. It's consistent. It makes sense. Now, the concept of 10, right? Hypothetically, it could have been 11, right? And then like 121, etc. It's 10. The fact that it's 10, I'm speculating the fact that it turned out this way may have something to do with the fact that the number of 10 is really built into the fabric of existence from the very beginning. Every world, every layer of reality has 10 spheres. Every nefesh has 10 koiches. The truth is the same thing with days of the week. We're very lucky that there are 7 days in the secular calendar. What if there was an 8-day week and a 2-day weekend once a week? What happened with Shabbos? It'd be really, really problematic. It'd be a big, big problem. You know, I think a lot of people never stop to think about that and to appreciate, and we take for granted the fact that the secular week happens to also be 7 days. It could have not been. Right? Their month is 30 and 31 days. Ours are 30 and 29. Their year is generally 365. Ours is 354. Our years have different lengths. Our months have different lengths. The weeks are the same. It's a very good thing. Now, the truth is there have been societies throughout history, apparently, that experimented with having non-7-day weeks, having weeks that were longer or shorter. And somehow everyone always ended up reverting back to the 7-day week. My guess is there is an element of just physical practicality. Maybe there's something that human nature just works with a 7-day week and not a 6-day week or 8-day week. And it's very likely that if that's the case, which my guess is it probably is, it's likely because of and related to the fact that the 7-day week is not just some arbitrary thing. Hashem created the world in 6 days, and then the 7th day is Shabbos. There are 6 primary midos, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, and then there's Malchus, 6 and 1, total of 7. 6 weekdays, 1 Shabbos, 7 days in the week. And each of the days of the week has a connection with one of the midos, which is why there's 7 and 7. And because the number 7 is built into the fabric of existence from the very beginning, and it's not just 7, it's 7 that's further subdivided into 6 and 1, that plays out in 6 weekdays and Shabbos. And that also filters down into the fabric of nature so that it just works with nature, that the way a week works most effectively is when it's 7 days, which is why it keeps on landing at that number. And then probably no one bothers even trying anything else anymore. Now, the 7 midos are part of a broader structure of 10, right? There are 10 spheres, which is 7 midos and 3 seichel. Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. That's 10. Now, when I said that 100 is 10 squared, it wasn't just some like random arbitrary geeky fact. Every one of the spheres has a component within it that's related to each of the 10 spheres, right? So during Spheres Omer, we have 49 days, 49 is 7 by 7, 7 midos, right? We have Chesed, Sheba, Chesed, and Gvura, Sheba, Chesed, and Tiferes, Sheba, Chesed. We go through the 7 components or aspects of Chesed, and then the 7 aspects of Gvura, and 7 aspects of Tiferes. That's when we're just talking about midos. When we're talking about all 10, there are 10 aspects within each one of the 10. So there are 100 sub-spheros, or 100 more specific details. And 100 years old, I'm going to tie things up. I think I'm going to have to go. When 100 years old, what that figuratively means is someone who's completed everything. They have completed the work they have to do on elevating, developing, and refining every single aspect of their personality. Now, just imagine someone who's taken one aspect of their personality and really worked it to the extent that was possible. That person would be, would be in an amazing state. Now imagine someone who's done that to 2 or to 3. And what about someone who hasn't just done it to 1, but they've really broken that 1 down into 10 and done it to every aspect of that? Now imagine someone who's done that to every aspect of all 10, right? That's like, it's not realistic. And the Mishnah tells us that when someone gets to that point where they've developed themselves to the degree that every aspect of every aspect of who they are, all 100 details have been developed, at that point, they're not really part of the world anymore. They've now reached such an elevated state of existence and an elevated state of experience. They're in a different category. We're not saying that they're worthless. On the contrary, we're saying there's someone who's already reached beyond the world, the regular experience of a normal person, consciousness and conscious experience. And the message of the Tzemach Tzedek was, people can work on something and make progress and get all carried away. Avram realized that even if he's at the age of 99 years old, even if he's developed 99 out of those 100 specific sub-characteristics, if there's still 1 left, he still has to circumcise himself. He still has to work on removing the barriers and opening up and coming closer and completing, his development. And when someone has that level of and depth of insight and tuned inness, that they realize that even once they've developed 99 out of 100 stages, they're not done and they have to continue. At that point, a person deserves for Hashem to be revealed to them. Sorry to have been so late and to run out on you.